Welcome to Shadows of America, where history's darkest secrets come to light. In the autumn of 1886, in the growing Texas town of Galveston, Undertaker Harrison Blackwell was arrested after authorities received multiple complaints from families who had used his funeral services. The complaints initially seemed minor. Families claimed that Blackwell had been inappropriate during funeral preparations, that he had made unusual requests about positioning bodies for photographs, and that he had taken longer than necessary with bodies during the embalming process. But when police searched Blackwell's funeral parlor and his adjoining photography studio, they discovered something that transformed these minor complaints into one of the most disturbing cases in Texas criminal history. Hidden in a locked room behind Blackwell's embalming area, they found more than 200 photographs that Blackwell had taken over his 9 years operating the funeral parlor in Galveston. But these weren't the post-mortem memorial photographs that were common and accepted in Victorian funeral practice, where deceased people were photographed as mementos for grieving families. These were photographs of living people, Blackwell's customers, their family members, townspeople he encountered, who had been posed, drugged, and photographed to appear dead, creating elaborate stage death scenes that Blackwell had collected like trophies over 9 years. The photographs showed people lying in coffins with their eyes closed and their hands folded, posed exactly like corpses being prepared for burial. They showed people arranged in funeral settings with flowers and mourning decorations, staged to look like actual post-mortem photographs. They showed close-up portraits of people's faces with makeup applied to make them look pale and lifeless, mimicking the appearance of death. And most disturbingly, many of the photographs showed people who appeared genuinely unconscious or semi-conscious, rather than simply posing, suggesting Blackwell had been drugging his victims to make them more convincingly corpse-like for his photographs. The investigation revealed that Harrison Blackwell had been systematically drugging people who came to his funeral parlor, sometimes the grieving family members who were arranging funerals, sometimes people he invited to his studio under various pretexts, sometimes even the living relatives of deceased people whose bodies he was preparing for burial. He would offer them tea or coffee laced with laudanum or chloral hydrate, substances that were legal and commonly available in the 1880s, but that could render people unconscious when administered in sufficient doses. Once his victims were unconscious or heavily sedated, Blackwell would pose them as corpses and photograph them, creating his secret collection of the living posed as dead. Blackwell's journals, also found in the locked room, documented his 9-year practice in disturbing detail. He described his fascination with the boundary between life and death, his belief that photographing living people as if they were dead would somehow capture their death essence before they actually died, and his sexual arousal from having unconscious people completely under his control to pose and photograph as he wished. The journals revealed a man with deeply disturbed psychology who had found in undertaking and photography the perfect combination of professions to facilitate his compulsions. Before we continue with the complete investigation into Harrison Blackwell and the 9 years he spent drugging and photographing living people as corpses in Galveston, Texas, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries daily, because what was found in that funeral parlor raises profound questions about trust, about the vulnerability of people in grief, and about how someone with dark compulsions can exploit professions that give them access to vulnerable people and to situations where unconsciousness and death are expected. Galveston, Texas in the 1870s and 1880s was a rapidly growing port city, with a population approaching 30,000 people, serving as a major commercial center for cotton shipping and as the most important city in Texas, before the devastating 1900 hurricane would later destroy much of it. The city had substantial wealth, a diverse population including significant German and Irish immigrant communities, and the full range of professional services that a major city required, including multiple funeral homes serving different neighborhoods and different economic classes. Harrison Blackwell had arrived in Galveston in 1877 at age 31, establishing himself as an undertaker and embalmer, serving middle-class families in the city's residential neighborhoods. Blackwell had training in both undertaking and photography, two professions that were often combined in the 19th century, since undertakers were frequently called upon to photograph deceased people as part of memorial services. His credentials appeared legitimate, his prices were reasonable, and his manner was appropriately somber and professional for someone in the funeral business. Victorian-era funeral customs created an environment where Blackwell's practices could remain hidden for years. Post-mortem photography was common and accepted. Families routinely had deceased loved ones photographed as final mementos, with the bodies posed in lifelike positions or in repose in coffins. The presence of photography equipment in funeral parlors was normal, and undertakers regularly spent hours alone with bodies, preparing them for viewing and burial. These customs meant that Blackwell's possession of photography equipment, his spending extended time with bodies, and his taking photographs in funeral settings raised no suspicion. But Blackwell's journals reveal that from the beginning of his practice in Galveston, he had been interested in photographing living people posed as dead, rather than actually photographing the deceased. His first documented victim was a young woman who had come to Blackwell's parlor in late 1877 to arrange her father's funeral. Blackwell had offered her tea to help calm her grief, had laced the tea with laudanum, and had photographed her while she was unconscious, posing her in a coffin with her hands folded across her chest. The woman had woken hours later with no memory of what had occurred beyond feeling unusually drowsy during the funeral arrangements. This first experience had apparently excited Blackwell, and it established the pattern he would follow for the next 9 years. He would identify vulnerable targets, grieving family members, women who came to his studio for portrait photography, people he met socially, who he could lure to his parlor on various pretexts. He would drug them with substances he kept readily available for embalming purposes, and he would photograph them while unconscious, posed to look dead, creating images that satisfied whatever psychological needs drove his compulsion. Blackwell's victims ranged in age from teenagers to elderly people, included both men and women, though women predominated, and came from various social classes and ethnic backgrounds. What they had in common was that they had all trusted Blackwell in his professional capacity, either as undertaker or as photographer, had accepted his offers of refreshment or medication to help with grief or nerves, and had been rendered unconscious without their knowledge or consent. Most victims had no memory of being photographed and had attributed their unusual drowsiness and lost time to the stress of grief or to other innocent causes. The drugging and photographing was not Blackwell's only violation of his victims. His journals document that he sometimes touched or examined unconscious victims inappropriately, treating their unconscious bodies as objects for his exploration and gratification. The extent of physical assault beyond photography is unclear from available records. Blackwell's trial focused primarily on the drugging and photographing, and victims who testified were often reluctant to discuss or may not have been aware of everything that had occurred while they were unconscious. The photographs themselves were technically skilled, showing Blackwell's genuine ability as a photographer. He had carefully lit and composed each image to create convincing death scenes. He had applied makeup to make victims appear more corpse-like, had positioned them with the attention to detail that Victorian post-mortem photographs typically showed, and had created settings with flowers and funeral decorations that made the staged scenes appear authentic. The technical quality of the photographs made them more disturbing rather than less. These weren't crude or obviously fake images, but carefully crafted representations of death using living victims who appeared genuinely dead due to the drugs and Blackwell's photographic skill. The journals document Blackwell's developing theories about death, photography, and what he was trying to achieve with his practice. He wrote extensively about his belief that death had a beauty and purity that life lacked, that the moment of death was the most important and most revealing moment in any person's existence, and that capturing that moment photographically would reveal essential truths about human nature. But since he couldn't photograph actual moments of death, since deaths didn't occur on predictable schedules that would allow him to be present with camera ready, he had developed the practice of staging death with living victims, believing that photographing unconscious people posed as dead would approximate the death photographs he wanted to create. This belief system was clearly delusional and served primarily to rationalize behavior that Blackwell presumably knew was criminal and immoral. His journals show awareness that drugging people without consent was illegal, that what he was doing would destroy his reputation and career if discovered, and that his victims would be horrified if they knew what he had done to them. But he continued the practice compulsively, apparently unable or unwilling to stop, despite recognizing the wrongness of his actions. The beginning of Blackwell's exposure came in September 1886, when a woman named Margaret Thornton had come to arrange her mother's funeral and had accepted tea from Blackwell during the consultation. Thornton had become drowsy, but had not fully lost consciousness, as Blackwell apparently intended. In her semi-conscious state, she had been aware of Blackwell moving her, positioning her body, and she had the sensation of bright light and of being photographed. When she had fully regained consciousness, she had confronted Blackwell, demanding to know what he had done to her. Blackwell had claimed she had simply fainted from grief, and that he had been trying to revive her, but Thornton hadn't believed him, and had reported the incident to police. Police initially dismissed Thornton's complaint, assuming she had indeed fainted and had misinterpreted Blackwell's attempts to help her. But Thornton was persistent, and she began speaking with other women in Galveston about their experiences with Blackwell. Several other women reported similar experiences, feeling unusually drowsy after accepting refreshment from Blackwell, having gaps in their memory during visits to his parlor, waking to find themselves in odd positions, or with their clothing slightly disheveled. The consistency of these reports convinced police that investigation was warranted. When police obtained a warrant and searched Blackwell's funeral parlor on October 15, 1886, they initially found nothing obviously incriminating. The public areas of the parlor were professionally maintained and showed nothing unusual. Blackwell's embalming area contained the expected equipment and chemicals. His photography studio contained standard portrait photography equipment, but one of the searching officers noticed that the dimensions of the building suggested there should be additional space that wasn't accounted for in the accessible rooms. Further investigation revealed a hidden door behind shelving in the embalming room, leading to a windowless chamber that Blackwell had constructed specifically to house his secret collection. This hidden room contained the photographs, more than 200 of them, carefully organized in albums with notes about each victim, including names, dates, and descriptions of how Blackwell had drugged and posed them. The room also contained Blackwell's journals documenting his 9 years of practice, his theories about death and photography, and his detailed records of each victim and each photographic session. The discovery triggered immediate arrest of Harrison Blackwell on charges including assault, drugging people without consent, and producing obscene photographs. The Criminal Code of 1880s Texas didn't have specific statutes addressing exactly what Blackwell had done. Photographing unconscious people wasn't a clearly defined crime, but prosecutors charged him under various statutes covering assault, administering drugs without consent, and creating materials that violated public decency standards. The charges were sufficient to hold him pending trial. The investigation to identify Blackwell's victims was complicated and traumatic. Police had the photographs and Blackwell's notes, identifying many victims by name, but notifying people that they had been drugged and photographed without their knowledge, while posed as corpses, required extreme sensitivity. Many victims were horrified to learn what had been done to them, experiencing violation and betrayal by someone they had trusted during vulnerable moments of grief or during what they thought were innocent photography sessions. Some identified victims refused to cooperate with the investigation, unable to face the public exposure and the social stigma that would come from being known as one of Blackwell's victims. Victorian social attitudes meant that even innocent victims of sexual crimes or privacy violations were often treated with suspicion and judgment, and many of Blackwell's victims preferred to remain silent rather than face public scrutiny. This reluctance to come forward meant that the full extent of Blackwell's victims was never completely documented. The more than 200 photographs represented a minimum number, but additional victims who weren't photographed or whose photographs hadn't been preserved might never have been identified. The trial of Harrison Blackwell in 1887 was a sensation, drawing national newspaper coverage and creating public debate about photography ethics, about funeral industry regulation, and about how society could protect people from predators who exploited professional trust. Blackwell's defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill, that his bizarre theories about death and photography demonstrated insanity, and that he should be committed to an asylum rather than imprisoned. Prosecutors argued that Blackwell's careful planning, his years of successfully hiding his activities, and his awareness that his actions were wrong all demonstrated that he was criminally responsible rather than insane. The jury convicted Blackwell on multiple counts of assault and administering drugs without consent, though they acquitted him on obscenity charges after his attorneys successfully argued that the photographs, while disturbing, didn't meet legal definitions of obscene materials, since they didn't show nudity or explicitly sexual content. Blackwell was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a substantial sentence by 1880 standards that reflected the jury's horror at what he had done, even though the specific crimes he had committed didn't fit neatly into existing legal categories. The question of what to do with Blackwell's photographs became controversial. Victims who were identifiable in the photographs demanded they be destroyed to protect their privacy and dignity, but prosecutors wanted to preserve them as evidence for potential appeals or for civil suits that victims might file. Some medical and psychological researchers wanted access to study the photographs as documentation of a rare paraphilia. Eventually, the court ordered most photographs destroyed after the trial concluded, with a small number preserved under seal as legal evidence, striking an imperfect compromise between victims' privacy needs and legal documentation requirements. The psychological impact on Blackwell's victims varied widely. Some managed to process the violation and to move forward with their lives, viewing what Blackwell had done as a disturbing experience, but not one that would define them. Others struggled with lasting trauma, violated trust, violation of bodily autonomy, while unconscious, and horror at imagining what else might have been done to them beyond what Blackwell documented in his journals. Several victims required ongoing medical care for psychological distress, and at least 2 victims' families reported that their relatives never fully recovered from learning what Blackwell had done. The funeral industry in Galveston and throughout Texas faced public scrutiny after the Blackwell case exposed how vulnerable people were when dealing with undertakers. The profession was largely unregulated in the 1880s, with no licensing requirements, no oversight of business practices, and no safeguards against undertakers who might abuse their access to vulnerable grieving families and to unconscious or deceased people. The case contributed to growing calls for professional regulation and for establishment of standards that would protect the public. Texas and several other states eventually passed laws requiring licensing of undertakers, establishing boards to investigate complaints, and creating standards for funeral home operations, including requirements that multiple people be present during body preparation to prevent abuses like Blackwell had committed. These regulations developed slowly over decades following the Blackwell case, representing one of its few positive legacies in terms of protecting future potential victims. The question of what had motivated Blackwell to develop his practice of drugging and photographing living people as dead was never fully answered. His journals documented his stated beliefs about death and photography, but provided limited insight into the deeper psychology that had generated those beliefs. Modern psychological understanding would likely classify Blackwell's behavior as involving multiple paraphilias, including somnophilia, sexual attraction to unconscious people, necrophilia, sexual attraction to corpses or death imagery, and voyeuristic elements related to photographing people without consent. The combination of these paraphilias, with professional access to vulnerable people, to drugs that could render people unconscious, and to funeral and photography equipment, created perfect conditions for Blackwell to act on his compulsions. His choice of undertaking and photography as professions might itself have been driven by his psychological needs. These professions provided legitimate access to the elements he needed to fulfill his desires, suggesting that he might have chosen his career path specifically because it would facilitate his compulsions, rather than his compulsions developing after he happened to enter these professions. The parallel between Blackwell's practice and consensual Victorian post-mortem photography raises questions about whether one practice influenced the other, or whether they simply coexisted in the same cultural environment. Post-mortem photography was widespread and accepted in the 19th century as a way of preserving memories of deceased loved ones, especially children who died young. The aesthetic of these photographs, peaceful poses, closed eyes, careful composition, was similar to what Blackwell created with his living victims. Whether Blackwell was perverting an accepted practice, or whether the accepted practice itself reflected unhealthy cultural attitudes toward death and photography, remains debated among historians. The few surviving photographs from Blackwell's collection that were preserved as evidence show technically competent, but deeply unsettling images. The unconscious victims appear genuinely dead, due to Blackwell's drugging and makeup application, creating convincing death photographs that served whatever psychological needs drove him to create them. Viewing these photographs knowing the victims were actually alive and drugged rather than deceased, creates visceral discomfort, highlighting how photography can be used to manipulate reality and to create false narratives that appear convincingly real. The impact on Galveston's community was significant and lasting. The revelation that a respected undertaker had been systematically drugging and photographing townspeople for 9 years created pervasive distrust of funeral services and of professional photographers. Many families who had used Blackwell's services experienced retroactive trauma, wondering whether they or their family members had been among his victims, whether their experiences of unusual drowsiness or missing time during funeral arrangements had been innocent or had been results of being drugged. This uncertainty created lasting anxiety that couldn't be fully resolved even after Blackwell's conviction. The business that Blackwell had operated was shut down immediately after his arrest, with the building eventually being purchased and converted to other uses. No undertaker would operate a funeral parlor in that building given its associations with Blackwell's crimes. The building's reputation meant it had difficulty finding tenants and eventually was demolished in 1902, removing the physical reminder of Blackwell's activities, but not erasing the cultural memory of what had occurred there. The question of whether Blackwell had committed similar crimes before arriving in Galveston was investigated, but never conclusively answered. He had worked as an undertaker in other locations before 1877, but whether he had drugged and photographed people in those previous locations was unknown. No evidence was found of previous collections of photographs or of complaints against him, but the absence of evidence didn't prove he hadn't engaged in similar behavior elsewhere. It was possible that Galveston was where Blackwell had first acted on his compulsions, or possible that he had been practicing his violations for years before settling in Galveston and being eventually caught. Harrison Blackwell served 11 years of his 15-year sentence before dying in prison in 1898 at age 52 from what was recorded as heart failure, but what some speculated might have been suicide. He had reportedly been a model prisoner who kept to himself, showed no remorse for his crimes, and spent his time reading and writing in journals that prison authorities later destroyed rather than preserving, given their likely disturbing content. His death in prison meant he never faced the social judgment and consequences of trying to reintegrate into society as a convicted predator. The legal precedent established by Blackwell's case influenced how future cases involving drugging and photographing people without consent were prosecuted. While specific statutes against such behavior were still developing, prosecutors could point to the Blackwell case as an example of how existing assault and drug administration laws could be applied to protect people from photographers and others who violated their bodily autonomy and privacy. The case thus contributed to legal evolution around consent, privacy, and the limits of what photographers and others with camera access could ethically and legally do. Modern discussions of consent in photography and of the ethics of photographing unconscious or vulnerable people often reference the Blackwell case as an extreme historical example of violation. The case raises questions that remain relevant. When is it ethical to photograph people who cannot consent? What responsibilities do photographers have toward vulnerable subjects? And how can society protect people from those who would exploit professional access to vulnerable populations? These questions have become more urgent in the digital age, when photographs can be taken and distributed more easily than in Blackwell's era. The surviving victims of Blackwell's crimes who lived into the early 20th century reportedly carried lasting effects from their experiences. Some developed anxiety around medical procedures or situations where they had to accept food or drink from others, struggling to trust in contexts where Blackwell had violated their trust. Others developed more generalized anxiety or post-traumatic symptoms related to having experienced violation of bodily autonomy while unconscious. The concept of trauma as a lasting psychological condition wasn't well understood in the 1880s and 1890s, leaving victims without appropriate frameworks for understanding or treating their ongoing distress. The role of substances like laudanum and chloral hydrate in facilitating Blackwell's crimes highlighted how easily available and poorly regulated such substances were in the 19th century. Both were legal, both were commonly used for legitimate medical purposes, including pain relief and sedation, and both could be obtained without significant oversight. Blackwell's ability to acquire and use these substances without raising suspicion was typical of the era, but contributed to growing recognition that better drug regulation was needed to prevent misuse by predators like him. The photographs that were destroyed after Blackwell's trial were reportedly burned in a supervised procedure where victims or their representatives could witness the destruction if they wished, providing some closure through knowing the images no longer existed. But the impossibility of being certain that all copies had been destroyed, that Blackwell hadn't made duplicates that were hidden elsewhere, that photographs hadn't been stolen from his collection before police discovered it, meant that victims could never be completely certain their images weren't still circulating somewhere, creating ongoing anxiety that no legal proceeding could fully resolve. The memorial erected to Blackwell's victims in 1910 in Galveston Cemetery doesn't name specific victims to protect their privacy and the privacy of their descendants, but acknowledges that citizens of Galveston were violated by one who abused professional trust, and commits to remembering their dignity and honoring their courage in exposing these violations. The memorial's vague language reflects ongoing tension between publicly acknowledging what occurred and protecting victims from continued exposure and stigma. The case has been studied by historians of photography, by criminal psychologists, and by scholars of Victorian culture as an example of how technological capabilities like photography, can be turned toward exploitative purposes when combined with predatory psychology and professional access to vulnerable people. The case appears in histories of photography ethics, in studies of paraphilias, and in examinations of how Victorian death culture created environments where certain forms of exploitation could occur more easily than they might in other cultural contexts. Modern funeral industry professional organizations often reference the Blackwell case in ethics training as an extreme example of professional misconduct and as a reminder of the trust that undertakers hold and the vulnerability of the families they serve. The case represents a cautionary tale about how grief and trust can be exploited and about the importance of maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and oversight, even in situations where traditional oversight might seem unnecessary. The question of whether the cameras and photographic equipment that Blackwell used in his crimes should have been preserved as historical artifacts or destroyed along with the photographs themselves was debated. The equipment was eventually sold as part of settling Blackwell's estate, with the proceeds going toward restitution for identified victims. This decision prioritized victims' financial compensation over historical preservation, reflecting judgment that the equipment's association with Blackwell's crimes outweighed any historical value it might have. The descendants of Blackwell's victims who are aware of their family connection to the case often carry complex feelings about that history. Some feel pride that their ancestors had courage to come forward and testify, contributing to Blackwell's conviction and to preventing future victims. Others feel shame or anxiety about the association, particularly given that Victorian attitudes meant being a victim of sexual or privacy violation carried social stigma that could affect families for generations. Most descendants prefer not to discuss the connection publicly, maintaining family privacy about traumatic history. The broader cultural impact of the Blackwell case on American attitudes toward death, photography, and funeral customs is difficult to measure, but probably contributed to gradual decline in post-mortem photography practices that had been common in the Victorian era. While post-mortem photography declined for various reasons, including changing cultural attitudes and improving photographic technology that made lifetime photographs more common, the Blackwell case may have contributed by creating associations between death photography and violation that made the practice feel less innocent than it had previously seemed. The archival records of the Blackwell case, including trial transcripts, police reports, and the small number of preserved photographs, remain sealed in Texas state archives with restricted access requiring specific authorization. Researchers who have accessed these materials report that they are as disturbing as historical accounts suggest, providing detailed documentation of systematic predatory behavior that spanned 9 years and affected more than 200 victims. The decision to keep most materials sealed reflects ongoing commitment to protecting victims' privacy even more than a century after the events. The Blackwell case has occasionally been invoked in modern debates about medical consent, about photography ethics in healthcare settings, and about the vulnerability of unconscious or sedated patients to potential exploitation by healthcare providers or others with professional access. While modern medical ethics and photography ethics are far more developed than they were in Blackwell's era, the fundamental questions his case raised about trust, consent, and professional boundaries remain relevant when thinking about how to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. The lasting lesson from the Blackwell case is perhaps that trust in professional contexts requires not just individual integrity, but also systemic safeguards that make exploitation difficult even when individual integrity fails. Blackwell was able to operate for 9 years because he worked alone, because there was no oversight of his practices, because victims were vulnerable and isolated during their interactions with him, and because the cultural context made certain forms of behavior seem normal when they should have raised suspicions. Modern professional practices that require witnesses, that mandate reporting of concerns, and that create multiple levels of oversight reflect recognition that trust alone is insufficient protection. The memorial services held for Blackwell's victims in the years after his conviction provided some community healing and acknowledgement of harm that had been done. These services allowed victims and their families to gather, to share their experiences in supportive environments, and to begin processing trauma collectively rather than in isolation. The community support that these services represented was crucial for many victims' recovery, providing validation and connection that helped counteract the isolation and shame that many had initially felt. Modern psychological understanding of how predators select and groom victims helps explain how Blackwell was able to victimize so many people without being caught earlier. He selected vulnerable targets, people who were grieving, people who were alone, people who trusted him because of his professional role. He created situations where victims accepted substances from him, making drugging seem like normal hospitality. He operated in professional contexts where unusual drowsiness or lost time could be attributed to grief or stress, rather than immediately raising suspicions of drugging. These grooming and selection strategies allowed him to victimize people systematically while avoiding detection. The case of Harrison Blackwell and his 9 years of drugging and photographing living people as corpses in Galveston, Texas, represents one of the most disturbing documented cases of professional exploitation in 19th century America. The more than 200 photographs he created, and the documented evidence in his journals of systematic violation of vulnerable people who trusted him in his professional capacity as undertaker and photographer, reveal a predator who used legitimate professional access to facilitate deeply disturbed compulsions. The victims who were drugged and photographed without their knowledge or consent, who learned years later what had been done to them during moments when they should have been protected and supported, experienced profound violation that many carried throughout their lives. Some found justice and healing through Blackwell's prosecution and conviction. Others struggled with lasting trauma from violation of trust and bodily autonomy that 19th century society was poorly equipped to recognize or treat.